5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello and welcome to the Fighting Moose Podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Jason Hendrickson. This is a podcast where we tell stories, some fictional and some historical, that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. Last week, we went on a cruise to the Bahamas. So after we got back, I went in search of a story relating to our vacation. I did find a book dealing with being on a ship, but instead of the story being about cruising, I found one about Jerusalem. This is fitting also because Israel has been in the news lately as they keep fighting back and forth with Hezbollah. So today, we are going to read a story about Jerusalem with a story titled The Holy City, which comes to us from the book The Ship Dwellers, written by Albert Bigelow Paine. As I close this out, hopefully you have had a chance to watch the Olympics. I haven't been able to watch it as much as I've wanted to, but I have still watched a little bit. It's always fun to watch these athletes compete against the other countries of the world. Now, let's turn to today's story. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Holy City. 3,900 years ago, it was merely called Salem, and was ruled over by Melchizedek, who feasted Abraham when he returned from punishing the 4 kings who carried off his nephew Lot. 500 years later, when Joshua ravaged Canaan, the place was known as Jebusi, the stronghold of the Jebusites, a citadel enthroned on a mountain fastness, which Joshua failed to conquer in spite of the traditional promise to Israel. Its old name has been not altogether dropped, and the transition from Jebusalem to Jerusalem and Jerusalem naturally followed. It was 400 years later, after Joshua's time, that David brought the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, and 15 years later, when he had become king, he took the stronghold of Zion, smote the difficult Jebusite even to the blind and the lame, and named the place the City of David. And David said on that day, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter, and smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame and the blind, that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. That is not as cruel as it sounds. Those incapables had no doubt been after David for backsheesh, and he felt just that way. I would like to appoint a few chiefs and captains of Jerusalem on the same terms. But I digress. The Bible calls it a fort, and it was probably not much more than that until David built round about and turned it into a city, the fame of which extended to Hiram, king of Tyre, who sent carpenters and masons and materials to David and built him a house. After which David took him some more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem, brought up the Ark of the Covenant from Kirjath Jearim, and prepared to live happily ever after. The Ark was, of course, very sacred, and one Uzzah was struck dead on the way up from Kirjath for putting out his hand to save it when it was about to roll into a ditch. It was with David that the glory of Jerusalem as a city began. Then came Solomon, David's second wife by Uriah's wife, wise, masterful, and merciless, and Jerusalem became one of the magnificent cities of the world. Under Solomon, the Hebrew race became more nearly a nation than ever before or since. Solomon completed the temple begun by David on Mount Moriah. The Ark of the Covenant was duly installed. Judaism had acquired headquarters, Israel, organization, and a capital. The fame of the great philosopher, poet, king spread to the ends of the earth. The mighty from many lands came to hear his wisdom and to gaze upon the magnificence of his court. The Queen of Sheba drifted in from her far sunlit kingdom with offerings of gold, spices, and precious stones, and she communed with him of all that was in her heart. That was more than 1,000 years before Christ. Greece had no history then. Rome had not been even considered. Culture and splendor were at high tide in the far east. It was the golden age of Jerusalem. The full tide must ebb, and the waning in Jerusalem began early. Solomon's reign was a failure at the end. Degenerating into a sensualist and an idolater, his enemies prevailed against him. The Lord stirred up an adversary in Hadad the Edomite, who had an old grudge. Also others, and trouble followed. The nation was divided. Revolt, civil wars, and abounding iniquities dragged the people down. That which would come to Rome 1,000 years later came now on a smaller scale to Israel. Egyptian and Arabian ravaged it by turns, and the Assyrian came down numerously. It became the habit of adjoining nations to go over and plunder and destroy Jerusalem. 400 years after Solomon, Josiah undertook to rehabilitate the nation and restore its ancient faith. He pulled down the heathen altars which Solomon had constructed, that no man might make his son or daughter pass through the fire to Moloch. He drove out and destroyed the iniquitous priests. He burned the high places of pollution and stamped the powder in the dust. It was too late. Josiah was presently slain in a battle with the Egyptians, and his son dropped back into the evil practices of his fathers. Nebuchadnezzar came then, and in one raid after another utterly destroyed Jerusalem, including the temple and the ark, and carried the inhabitants to the last man into a captivity which lasted 70 years. Then Nehemiah was allowed to return with a large following and rebuild the city. But its prosperity was never permanent. The Jews were never a governing nation. Discontented and factional, they invited conquest. Alexander came, and later Rome. Herod the Great renewed and beautified the city, and to court favor with the Jews, rebuilt the temple on a splendid scale. This was Jerusalem in its final glory. 70 years later, the Jews rebelled, and Titus destroyed the city so completely that it is said to have remained a barren waste without a single inhabitant for 50 years. Today the city is divided into quarters: Christian, Jewish, Mohammedan, and Armenian. All worships are permitted, and the sacred relics, most of them of whatever faith, are accessible to all. Such in scanty outline is the story of the holy city. It has been besieged and burned and pulled down no less than 16 times, totally destroyed and rebuilt at least 8 times, and the very topography of its site has been changed by the accumulation of rubbish. Hillsides have disappeared. Where once were hollows are now mere depressions or flats. Most of the streets that Jesus and the prophets trod lie from 30 to 100 feet below the present surface and bear little relation, even in direction, to those of the present day. Yet certain sites and landmarks have been identified, while others are interesting for later reasons. Hence, both the skeptic and believer, Jerusalem is still a shrine.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fighting Moose podcast. Please join us next time as we read another exciting story. Today's music was provided by the artist Analog by Nature, and the audio clips were provided from NASA. For more information to download and or listen to audio or materials from all our recordings, or to contact us, please visit www.thefightingmoose.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcast or on iTunes, and tell a friend. Thank you for your patronage, and as always, try and do a random act of kindness every day.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle turned its place in history and has come to a final stop.